How useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into the success of the Great Leap Forward? Explain your answer using sources B and C and your knowledge of the historical context. 8 marks. Here's the mark scheme for this question, which you can find out about in more detail in the overview video. But we do know that all 8 marks here are awarded for AO3, and that's your analysis and evaluation of source utility. All that means really is you making a judgment on how useful this source is to the inquiry that you've been given in the question. In order to make that judgment, you might focus on one of these things, so how accurate it might be, how reliable you think it is, any limitations, so things that it doesn't include or isn't really that helpful for, knowledge of the author which is given to you above the source, or valuable information offered by the source. If you can focus on maybe 1 or 2 of these to decide how useful the source is for your inquiry, it's a really easy way to score highly in AO3. That means that rather than just making an assertion, so saying this source is useful, you need to reason, you need to use one of these factors above to decide how useful the source is. You'll also be thinking about the content, so what the source actually says. You'll be thinking about the context, so what you know about when it was written or what it's written about. And provenance, so who wrote it, when did they write it, why did they write it, and so on. So just try and keep those things in mind. You don't have to talk about everything, but just try and keep them in mind to make sure that your answer is really nicely focused on utility. It's also important to remember that the question isn't asking you to compare source B and source C. In fact, you could actually talk about them separately. You've got to think about why B is useful and why C is useful, not if one is more useful than the other. Here are the bands for this question. Now you can see in order to score in the highest band, you need to show developed reasoning. So maybe you've used one of the factors that we listed above to make a judgment on how useful the source is and really clearly explain your thinking. You've also considered the provenance, so where the source came from, and how that might impact how useful the source is. You could also draw in some contextual knowledge, so stuff that you already know about the topic, to help you to interpret the source and make that judgment. Essentially, this question is all about stating how useful you think the source is, using the information given to you in the source and before it, and the information that you already have about the topic, to explain why you made that judgment. Showing that you can do this well is how you can score in the highest band. As long as the points you make here are relevant to the question and correct, the examiner will accept them. But let's take a look at some examples for source B. So you can see that the mark scheme is divided into the utility of the content of the source, the utility of the source's provenance and purpose, and of the source in relation to its historical context. So firstly, content. So what does the source actually say? You might identify that it shows widespread discontent towards the Great Leap Forward. Then moving on to provenance, where it comes from, and purpose, and what it intends to do. So you might note that it comes directly from a local committee discussing what they've heard directly from the peasantry, so it's quite an interesting insight from the people themselves. And finally, historical context. So what knowledge do you already have that you can bring in to support your argument? You might note that approximately 20 million people died of starvation as a result of the Great Leap Forward. The source exemplifies popular attitudes towards the movement. So we can see there that we've taken all 3 factors and we've given us a short point for each of them. Now, if you can find a way of linking all of those 3 things together, it shows that you've approached source B from lots of different angles, you've thought about it analytically, and you've composed a really nicely developed point. And it's that kind of development which is really necessary to scoring highly. Take a look at the rest of the points here, as well as the ones for source C in a second, to see if there's anything you might have added to your answer.